Okay, so in this video, we're going to consider the whole area of what we call trade quotas. And you do find some quotas in the world economy. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. These are from 2021. China is raising the import quota on Australian wool. China and Australia have a bit of a spat going on in terms of trade between the two countries. And this is an example of China increasing the quota of wool that they will receive from Australia. Okay. Um, the next one is a slightly different one, but I'm going to introduce you to it anyway. Um, this is the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and as you know, they have to take a view on some of these things, and there's this dispute about import controls on rice, wheat, and corn. And they ruled in 2019 against China's use of what they call a tariff rate quota. Now, that's a slightly odd one, and all it means, and you don't really need this for the exam, is that some countries, in this case it would be China, allow a certain amount of products to come in as a quota, because a quota is a physical restriction. The number of goods coming into the country is actually restricted. And then after that, they put a tariff on. They're allowed to put a tariff. So they raise the tax on imports after that. So up to a certain volume, there's no tariff. And then after that, there is a tariff. And there is a few of those around in the world economy, but you don't, there's no real diagram for that. So please don't worry about it. This is the one I just wanted to really show you. This is from the Guardian newspaper, November 2020, so it is quite up to date. And it's China's foreign ministry again, this spat between Australia and China. Um, it's warned Australia that to handle the bilateral relationship with mutual respect and equality after it, that's China, put 212% tariffs on Australian wines. And you'll see in a minute that they thought that they were dumping their wine, i.e., selling it to China at a lower price than the actual cost of making it. And as the country increases its coal import quotas. So China has a tariff against wine. So it's a good article. It's a good bit of context this for both tariffs and quotas. And it's increasing the quota by 20 million tons. So other countries are able to get that quota of 20 million tons because it says it's likely to exclude Australia. So it's using the quotas and excluding Australia from those quotas. And it says there's hundreds of millions of tons anchored off the Chinese coast. So Australia have been used to sending their coal over to China, and now it's anchored off the coast, so they can't. Also, it says the Guardian Australia understands that China is reducing the customs clearance times for Australia's key coal export competitors, Indonesia and Russia. In other words, using customs clearance times is a really good example of a non-tariff barrier. Okay, so often in your work you have to talk about tariffs and quotas and subsidies, but that's an example also. These clearance times, getting your goods through custom, if a country like China reduces it for Indonesia and Russia, but still has the same old clearance time for Australia, that's an example, as I say, of a non-tariff barrier. So very useful context, hopefully, for you. Now, how does a quota work? What sort of diagram do you need? Well, often you don't need a diagram in the sense that the examiner won't ask you for one, but it is a useful thing to have. And I would say that what you need to spot is that a quota is a physical quantity. It's an actual number of goods coming in. So the argument is that if this is our domestic supply curve without a quota, and this is the world price, and therefore imports are this distance here, as we've seen before, I'm putting a little, it's faded a bit here. It's for comparison. That would be a tariff, so I'm going to use that as a comparison point. You don't have to put that in. I would be saying that the quota means that the domestic supply can be here, but also in addition to that domestic supply, we will allow this domestic supply plus a quota. So this curve here is the domestic supply plus some physical quantity. Now, I do stop it at here because only because if you think about it, if that's the world price, if this was being supplied, then below the world price we would come back to the domestic supply down here. So the supply curve sort of looks like this, this, and this, but you don't need the diagram. Don't worry about that point. The point is, though, the big point you do need to know is that at point D, that is what has happened to demand. So the demand has fallen from B to D, Q2 to Q3. In other words, it has reduced because of the higher price. So this is now the equilibrium. We don't have this, okay? This is the equilibrium price in the marketplace. Now, that has meant that there has been this increase in the supply from the domestic suppliers, okay? So the world suppliers will supply up here, okay, and then the domestic suppliers will go from this point to this point, from this to this. So therefore, the distance between them, which happens to be, look, the quota, is the level of imports, okay? So the key thing that you need to spot from this diagram is that there's a physical quota, it's an actual number of goods, the price still rises. So it's the same as a tariff in that respect. So you have lost this consumer surplus, which we'll see in the next slide. Domestic producers are increasing their output, okay? But there's a big difference. And if there's a question about the type of protectionism, this is what you need to bring up. And it's in here that this area here is the loss of the consumer surplus, exactly the same as we did in a tariff diagram, okay? So this is exactly the same as we just had before. However, there is a transfer to the producer. So this is the increase in the producer surplus, just as we had with the tariff diagram. And then you have a box here. Now, this box is a really important box because this is the gain to the importers who managed to keep importing this distance here. In other words, they were willing and able to supply at any of those prices there, but because of the quota, they're actually getting that price. So that is a gain to an importer. And in the tariff diagram, that was a gain to the government. In other words, it was a transfer within the domestic economy. Now what we're saying is that that is not a transfer within the domestic economy, okay? And this box here is the only transfer within the domestic economy. In other words, the welfare loss is going to be higher under a quota because the importer gains that box. That's not a transfer to the government of the economy, okay? So you lose consumer surplus. This is transferred. This is a welfare loss triangle. This is a welfare loss triangle. And this is also a welfare loss to the economy, the domestic economy that has put that quota on. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of how you would analyze, bring in some context, and evaluate the use of quotas.